Okay, so I'm going to go through now some reasons why the doctrine of double effect is not a good way of justifying moral actions. Firstly, the problem with this idea of focusing on, someone having the right intentions behind their action. It is nigh on impossible to judge the intent behind someone's actions. We are not, by our nature as human beings, mind readers. We aren't able to tell, honestly, the reason why someone has made a decision, not with any degree of certainty anyway. So, if we don't really know the intent behind someone's action, how can we make an honest decision about whether they've done something for the quote unquote right reasons or not? If someone were to be in a situation where they're acting in self defense and they kill someone who's attacking them, how do we genuinely know that in that moment their intent wasn't to cause that person, harm? Their intent wasn't to express the anger and frustration that they were feeling at having been attacked. We can't, there's nothing external to them which confirms to us what their intent was at that particular moment. So there'd be no distinction that we'd be able to make between someone who killed an attacker because they were trying to save their own life, and for no other reason, and and a person who killed their attacker because they were angry and lost their temper. Both of those could look externally to us identical, and it would be almost impossible without being, as I say, mind readers, which we're not, to be able to distinguish between the two. The same thing would apply when we look at kind of doctors. This is, again, the most likely application of the doctrine of double effect when a doctor prescribes someone pain medication, or some sort of medication where there is a side effect. If a doctor prescribes someone pain medication because they are terminally ill, it is a high dosage and it has the secondary effect of killing them. How do we know that the doctor's intention wasn't genuinely to euthanize them and to relieve their suffering, as opposed to just wanting to stop them being in pain? It's almost impossible to distinguish between the two, as I say, externally, but I'd argue even in terms of in that person's mind. How would you genuinely be able to tell in your own mind that your only intent was pure, that your only intent was to stop the person feeling pain, and that there wasn't at least a part of you which gave them that pain medication, knowing that it would kind of bring about the end of their life and wanting that for them because you could see the suffering that they were in? It would be nigh on impossible to distinguish between those two if you were an observer, and I'd argue pretty difficult, even in your own mind, to work out what your intention was 100%. The second issue with the doctrine of double effect is that it's hard to know when to apply it. How do we know the situations in which we can say, well, that was a situation with where the doctrine of double effect would apply, and that is not? As I've said before, it's quite obvious and quite clear that this principle will apply to situations like medical ethics. But how do we know that it doesn't apply to a whole range of situations, from the kind of the mundane in the everyday to the more serious? So, if we think about using contraception, it could be seen as using contraception, particularly in areas where there's a prevalence or a high level of infections because of HIV, things like that. It could be seen as kind of that you're using contraception in order to save someone's life. And your intention, is to actively to reduce the death rate in a particular area. How can you distinguish between kind of that, whether that's a situation where we can apply the doctrine or not? Obviously, a secondary effect of you using the contraception would be that you don't bring about a child. So that's potentially, according to the doctrine, if we're going to apply it here, an acceptable kind of negative impact of the action, because it wouldn't necessarily be what you intended to do, and you would still be bringing about the positive consequence of saving people's lives. So, could we apply it to those situations? Could we apply it to lots of different situations? As I say, from the mundane and the everyday to the more extreme. If that's the case, then it sort of starts to feel, because realistically, there are virtually no actions that you can choose which have only one consequence. And so there's pretty much in every choice we make going to be a double effect, if not a triple, quadruple, etc., etc. There just aren't acts which have only one consequence in isolation and no domino effect, no knock-on effect. So potentially, if we can apply the doctrine of double effect to medical situations, then we can apply it to situations regarding contraception and procreation, then we can apply it to lots of other different situations. And we've got a bit of a slippery slope situation here where we're allowing a lot of negative consequences in pretty much every situation, because we're acknowledging the fact that, there is always more than one consequence to an act. And so we stop really having any kind of firm moral rules that we should and shouldn't apply, like the primary precepts, because we're just going, yes, well, this is another example of the doctrine of double effect. I've got to make an allowance here. Well, this is another example here. It makes the foundational principles of natural law feel kind of meaningless, really, because there are so many sort of exceptions to it almost, where we'd apply the doctrine of double effect instead. And the third and final issue with the doctrine of double effect is that it's basically subject to all of the issues and criticisms that apply to any consequentialist theory of ethics. So any theory where we make a judgment about the rightness or wrongness of actions based on the consequences that it creates. If we're doing that, how do we measure consequences? How do we measure kind of the impacts? I know Bentham attempts to do it with his hedonic calculus, measuring how intense the pleasure is, how long the pleasure is, how likely it is to occur, etc., etc. But it's been generally accepted that was an ineffective way of measuring pleasure. And so, if we can't even measure pleasure as a consequence of our actions, how are we going to measure consequences more generally? Not just taking into account the pleasure cause, but any consequences of an action. How do we measure all those possible consequences? And how far should we measure? Should we just measure the consequences of the individuals directly involved in the action? Or should we measure consequences, to secondary people on the peripheral of the decision, etc., etc.? So, my decision to, as a doctor, offer pain medication, which I am fully aware will both ease a patient's pain and bring about the end of their life. Do I take into account the consequences just for that individual, because it's their life and therefore their decision to make that choice? Do I take into account the consequences for their family members, their friends, their loved ones, their local community? Do I take into account the precedent that I'm setting for other doctors within the environments where I work, the hospital that I work in, and therefore kind of the impacts, the consequences that my decision is going to have on other members of the medical community, the consequences that could then have on, there's a never-ending sequence of consequences with any action. Like the theory, the chaos theory. Sorry, I've forgotten the word. Then chaos theory. If a butterfly flaps its wings in one part of the world, it causes a hurricane in another part of the world. Nothing we do is entirely in isolation. There's always kind of unknown and unforeseeable consequences to all of our actions. So if we're going to judge the rightness or the wrongness of an act based on its consequences, at least in part, then we're running into problems because we don't know what the consequences are. We don't know how to measure them, how far we should measure them, how long they're going to last for, and what they're going to be. It's almost impossible, really, to measure the consequences of an action because they are so vast and so many.